A billionaire's homecoming should have been filled with the laughter of his infant twins and the warm embrace of family. Instead, Marcus Thornwell opened his penthouse door to find his beloved nanny and his one-year-old children bound and gagged on the living room floor. But the real shock wasn't the scene itself, it was the person standing over them, calm and collected, holding a stack of documents that would unravel 20 years of carefully constructed lies. Why would someone terrorize innocent children to expose a secret? The answer lies in a story of betrayal so profound, it had poisoned 3 generations and was finally demanding its reckoning. The rain hammered against the windows of the black Mercedes S-Class as it wound through the serpentine roads leading up to Apex Towers, the most exclusive residential building in Vancouver's Cole Harbour district. Marcus Thornwell sat in the back seat, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate despite the 15-hour flight from Singapore. His sharp jawline was set in its usual expression of controlled authority, his steel-gray eyes scanning through emails on his tablet with mechanical efficiency. At 42, Marcus embodied the very definition of self-made success. Thornwell Dynamics, his tech conglomerate specializing in artificial intelligence and automation systems, had revolutionized 3 different industries in the past decade. His net worth had crossed the billion-dollar threshold 5 years ago, and analysts predicted it would triple within the next 2. He was featured on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Bloomberg Businessweek. He gave TED Talks. He sat on the boards of 4 different philanthropic organizations. But none of that mattered as much as what waited for him at home, his twin daughters, Lily and Sophie, who had just celebrated their first birthday 2 weeks ago while he was negotiating a merger in Tokyo. The guilt of missing that milestone gnawed at him, despite the video call he'd managed to squeeze in between meetings. He'd watched them smash their little fists into their matching pink cakes, their faces lighting up with pure, uncomplicated joy. His daughters. His entire world, wrapped up in 2 tiny, perfect human beings. The car pulled into the underground garage of Apex Towers, and Marcus gathered his belongings. "Thank you, Raymond," he said to his driver, a man who had been with him for 8 years and knew better than to make small talk when his employer was in work mode. "Welcome home, Mr. Thornwell," Raymond replied with a professional nod. The private elevator whisked Marcus up to the 42nd floor, where his penthouse occupied the entire level. The doors opened directly into his foyer, a space of marble floors, contemporary art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the harbor and the mountains beyond. It was 7:30 p.m., and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "Celeste," he called out, expecting to hear the cheerful voice of his nanny, Celeste Moreau. She was a gem, a French-Canadian woman in her late 50s who had come highly recommended by 3 different families in his social circle. She'd been with them for 8 months now, ever since his wife, Victoria, had passed away from a sudden brain aneurysm. That devastating loss had shattered Marcus's world, leaving him a widower at 41 with 2 infant daughters who would never remember their mother. Celeste had been a godsend. Patient, warm, experienced, and utterly devoted to the twins. She sang to them in French, read them stories, kept meticulous schedules, and somehow managed to keep the enormous penthouse running smoothly despite Marcus's frequent absences. But there was no cheerful response to his call. No sounds of babies babbling or the soft classical music Celeste liked to play during the twins' evening routine. The silence was wrong. It pressed against his ears like a physical weight. "Celeste," he called again, louder this time, setting down his briefcase and moving further into the apartment. That's when he heard it, a muffled sound. Not quite a cry, but something desperate and choked. His heart rate spiked instantly. Every instinct in his body went on high alert as he moved quickly through the expansive living room. And then he saw them. Celeste was on the floor near the white sectional sofa, her hands bound behind her back with what looked like zip ties. Her ankles were similarly restrained. A strip of silver duct tape covered her mouth. Her eyes, wide with terror and streaming with tears, locked onto his the moment he entered the room. She was making frantic sounds behind the gag, her whole body trembling. But it was the sight next to her that stopped Marcus's heart completely. His daughters. Lily and Sophie, his precious 1-year-old twins, were in their playpen, but something was horribly wrong. Soft cotton cloth had been tied around their tiny wrists, not tight enough to hurt, but enough to restrict their movement. Similar cloth bands were around their ankles. They weren't gagged, but they were crying, not the usual fussy crying of tired babies, but frightened, confused wails that pierced straight through Marcus's chest like daggers. "What the?" he started, rushing forward, his mind unable to process the scene. Who had done this? Where were they? Were his children hurt? "I wouldn't move any closer if I were you, Mr. Thornwell." The voice came from behind him, calm, female, and utterly devoid of fear. Marcus spun around, his body instinctively moving between the voice and his children. A woman stood near the entrance to his study, a room he always kept locked. She was holding a manila folder in one hand and what appeared to be his own letter opener in the other, not in a threatening manner, but casually, as if it were simply something to occupy her hands. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She wore simple black clothes, jeans and a turtleneck, and her face was striking in its intensity. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to look straight through him, and an expression of cold, calculated determination. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus demanded, his voice a low growl. "What have you done to my children?" "To Celeste?" "Your children are fine," the woman said, her tone matter-of-fact. "The restraints are soft cotton scarves. They can't hurt themselves." "I would never harm children, Mr. Thornwell. Unlike some people." The last two words were loaded with bitter emphasis. "If you want money," Marcus began, his mind racing through hostage protocols, security measures, anything that would get this woman away from his family. "I don't want your money," she interrupted, taking a step closer. "Though God knows you have plenty of it. Money that should have been mine. Money built on theft and lies and a good man's corpse." Marcus felt ice water flood his veins. The words made no sense, but the way she said them, with such cold certainty, triggered something deep in his memory. A warning bell that had been silent for 2 decades suddenly began to toll. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice wavered slightly. "You need to leave. Now. Or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," she said, gesturing to his pocket where his phone was. "Call them. Tell them there's an intruder in your home. Tell them she tied up your nanny and your babies. And then I'll show them what's in this folder." She lifted the manila folder slightly. Documents that prove Marcus Thornwell, tech visionary, billionaire philanthropist, devoted father, is actually Marcus Hartley. The man who murdered my father and stole his life's work. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Hartley. A name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 20 years. A name he'd buried under legal documents, falsified records, and a carefully constructed new identity. How did she know that name? His face must have betrayed him because the woman's expression shifted from cold determination to something darker, triumphant vindication. "Oh, you remember now, don't you?" she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You remember Nathan Hartley? My father. Your partner. The actual genius behind the Sentinel algorithm that made Thornwell Dynamics what it is today." Marcus couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Behind him, his daughters continued to cry, and Celeste was making desperate sounds behind her gag, but it all seemed to fade into a distant roar. This couldn't be happening. This was impossible. Nathan Hartley had no children. He'd been unmarried, a brilliant loner who'd thrown himself into his work with obsessive dedication. Nathan didn't have children, Marcus finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. "He didn't know about me," the woman replied, her eyes glistening now with barely suppressed emotion. "My mother, Elena Vasquez, was his girlfriend for 6 months in 2003. She got pregnant. She tried to tell him, but he was so consumed with your partnership, with the work, that he pushed her away. Said he couldn't handle a relationship and the company at the same time. She left Vancouver, went back to her family in Mexico. I was born 8 months later. She named me Isabella." Isabella. The name meant nothing to Marcus, but the timeline, 2003, that was the year everything had happened. The year Nathan had died. The year Marcus Hartley had become Marcus Thornwell. My mother followed his career from afar, Isabella continued, moving slightly closer. She saw the news when Nathan died in that convenient house fire. She saw how his partner, you, walked away with everything. The patents, the company, the technology. She wanted to contact you, to claim what should have been mine as Nathan's daughter. But she was undocumented. She was afraid. She had no proof, no resources. So she stayed silent. Marcus's mind was spinning. A house fire. Yes, that's what the official report had said. An electrical fire in Nathan's workshop, late at night. Tragic. Accidental. The fire marshal had ruled it as faulty wiring, and Nathan's body had been found in the wreckage, burned beyond recognition but identified through dental records. Dental records that Marcus had access to through their shared business insurance. Dental records that could be manipulated. I don't know what your mother told you, Marcus said carefully, trying to regain his composure, but your father's death was an accident. A terrible accident. I lost my best friend that night. I've carried that grief for 20 years. Liar. Isabella's voice cracked like a whip, and for the first time, raw emotion broke through her controlled facade. You didn't lose anything except a problem. Nathan was going to leave the company. He'd figured out that you'd been stealing from the business accounts. He had evidence. He told my mother about it in their last phone call. Yes, they'd reconnected just weeks before he died. He said he was going to confront you, turn you in if necessary, and start over somewhere else. Marcus felt sweat breaking out on his forehead. How much did she actually know? How much was speculation? That's absurd, he said, but even to his own ears, the denial sounded weak. Is it? Isabella pulled a document from the folder and held it up. Even from a distance, Marcus could see it was old, yellowed slightly with age. This is a letter Nathan wrote to my mother 3 days before he died. He never got to send it because you killed him before he could. But my mother kept it all these years. In it, he details exactly what he'd discovered, how you'd been siphoning money to offshore accounts, how you'd been secretly meeting with venture capitalists behind his back, how you were planning to push him out of his own company. Marcus's world was crumbling. That letter couldn't exist. He'd searched Nathan's apartment after the fire. He'd taken every document, every computer file, everything that could have connected him to any wrongdoing. But he hadn't known about Elena. Hadn't known about a girlfriend, about letters, about a daughter growing up in Mexico who would one day come for him. My mother died 2 years ago, Isabella said, her voice thick with grief now. Cancer. She made me promise on her deathbed that I would get justice for my father. That I wouldn't let you keep living this lie. So I've spent 2 years planning this. Learning everything about you. Following your life, your success, your perfect image. She took another step closer, and Marcus noticed for the first time that her hands were shaking slightly, betraying the emotion beneath her controlled exterior. And then your wife died, Isabella continued. And you were left with 2 baby girls. Daughters you love more than anything in the world. I watched you with them, Mr. Thornwell. Or should I call you Mr. Hartley? I watched how you hold them, how you look at them. They're your whole world. Marcus's protective instincts surged. If you touch my daughters. I told you, I would never hurt children, Isabella snapped. That's what separates me from you. You see, I had a choice. I could have gone to the police, but 20-year-old evidence is hard to prosecute. I could have gone to the media, but you have lawyers and PR teams that would bury the story. So I needed leverage. I needed something that would make you listen. Make you confess. Make you pay for what you did. She gestured toward the playpen where Lily and Sophie were still crying, their little faces red and tear-stained. So I became your nanny, Isabella said. Marcus's blood turned to ice. What? Celeste Moreau doesn't exist, Isabella explained with bitter satisfaction. Or rather, she does, but she's my aunt, my mother's sister. She's the one tied up on your floor. The real Celeste Moreau, the one you thought you hired, is actually me. I created an entire false identity, complete with references from families that don't exist, background checks that were clean because I made sure they were. I've been living in your home for 8 months, Mr. Thornwell. Caring for your children. Learning your routines. Searching your private study. Yes, I picked that lock months ago, and finding exactly what I needed. The revelation was staggering. The woman he'd trusted with his most precious treasures, the person who'd held his daughters when they cried, who'd fed them and bathed them and sung them to sleep, she'd been planning this revenge the entire time. You're insane, Marcus whispered. I'm determined, Isabella corrected. There's a difference. And now, Mr. Thornwell, you're going to sit down, and you're going to listen to everything I have to say. You're going to hear the truth about what you did to my father. And then you're going to decide what kind of man you really are. She pointed to the sofa. Sit. Marcus didn't move. Every fiber of his being wanted to rush her, to grab his children and run, to call security. But something in her eyes, a desperate, dangerous edge, told him that she was on the verge of doing something unpredictable. And his daughters were too close, too vulnerable. If I sit, if I listen, he said carefully, you'll untie my children? Isabella considered this, then nodded slowly. Your children, yes. Not Celeste, she's insurance. But I'll free your daughters if you give me your word you'll hear me out. You have my word, Marcus said immediately. He would have promised anything in that moment. Isabella walked over to the playpen, and Marcus tensed, ready to spring forward if she made any threatening move. But she was gentle with the twins, carefully untying the soft scarves from their tiny wrists and ankles. The moment they were free, Lily and Sophie both reached up toward her with the unconscious trust that babies have for their caregivers. It was a knife to Marcus's heart. His children loved this woman who had been living a lie. Isabella picked up Sophie, the younger twin by 4 minutes, and carried her to Marcus. Then she went back for Lily. Marcus held both his daughters close, feeling their little bodies shake with residual sobs. He checked them over frantically, no marks, no injuries, just fear and confusion. They're fine, Isabella said quietly, watching him. I told you, I would never hurt them. I've loved them like they were my own these past 8 months. That's the cruelest irony, isn't it? I came here for revenge, but I fell in love with your daughters. They're innocent in all of this. Marcus looked up at her, his daughters clutched protectively in his arms, and saw something that surprised him, genuine anguish in her eyes. Then why do this, he asked. Why traumatize them? Why traumatize yourself? Because, Isabella said, her voice breaking slightly, I need you to understand what it feels like to have everything you love threatened by someone else's greed. I need you to feel a fraction of what my mother felt, knowing that my father's killer was living a life of luxury while we struggled. I need you to look at your daughters and imagine them growing up without you, because that's what I had to do. I grew up without my father because you took him from me. She walked back to where Celeste was tied up and sat down on the floor beside her, suddenly looking exhausted. The adrenaline that had been fueling her seemed to drain away, leaving behind a young woman who looked lost and broken. So here's what's going to happen, Isabella said quietly. You're going to tell me the truth. All of it. What really happened to Nathan Hartley on the night of August 14, 2003. And depending on what you tell me, I'll decide what to do with the evidence I have. Marcus looked down at his daughters, who were finally calming down in his arms. Their small hands gripped his shirt, their heads resting against his chest. They trusted him completely, utterly, the way children trust their parents to keep them safe from all the monsters in the world. But what if the monster was him? The ghost of Nathan Hartley, brilliant, intense, sometimes difficult Nathan, rose up in Marcus's memory. A man who had been his friend before he became his victim. A man whose daughter was now sitting on his living room floor, demanding the truth that had been buried for 2 decades. Marcus Thornwell, the billionaire, the tech titan, the man who commanded boardrooms and controlled empires, felt the foundations of his entire life beginning to crack. And in that moment, with his daughters in his arms and his past incarnate sitting before him, he knew that the reckoning he'd feared for 20 years had finally arrived. The question was, what kind of man would he choose to be now? The silence in the penthouse stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft breathing of the twins as they finally settled in their father's arms. Marcus Thornwell, or Marcus Hartley, as Isabella insisted on calling him, sat on the leather sofa, his mind racing through scenarios, calculations, and desperate possibilities. 20 years of carefully constructed lies were unraveling in real time, and he needed to think, needed to find a way out of this nightmare. But Isabella wasn't giving him time to strategize. "I'm going to tell you a story," she said, still sitting on the floor beside the bound Celeste. Her voice had lost its sharp edge, replaced by something softer but no less dangerous, the quiet intensity of someone who had been carrying a burden for far too long. "It's about a brilliant man named Nathan Hartley who had a gift for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. He could look at streams of data and find the hidden architecture beneath. That's what made him special. That's what made the Sentinel algorithm possible." Marcus flinched at the name. The Sentinel algorithm was the crown jewel of Thornwell Dynamics, the breakthrough technology that had revolutionized predictive analytics across multiple industries. It was worth billions. And yes, it had been Nathan's brainchild. "Nathan met you in graduate school at UBC, Isabella continued, her dark eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "You were the business major with the charisma and the connections. He was the computer science genius with the vision but no idea how to sell it. You became partners. Best friends, even. You were going to change the world together." She pulled another document from her folder, a photograph this time, creased and faded. Even from where he sat, Marcus could see it, two young men, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Nathan, with his wild curly hair and intense eyes. And Marcus, younger, leaner, with that same confident smile he still wore in boardroom meetings. "My mother took this picture," Isabella said softly, touching the photograph with something like reverence. "It was at a barbecue in 2003, just a few months before everything fell apart. She said Nathan talked about you constantly. His partner. His brother. The only person who understood his vision." Marcus felt something twist in his chest, guilt, perhaps, or the ghost of genuine friendship. There had been a time when he and Nathan were truly close, when their partnership felt like destiny rather than a business arrangement. "What happened, Mr. Thornwell?" Isabella asked, leaning forward. "When did it change? When did your friend become an obstacle?" Marcus looked down at his daughters. Sophie had fallen asleep against his chest, her tiny fist clutching his tie. Lily was still awake, her wide blue eyes, Victoria's eyes, staring up at him with innocent trust. What would he tell them someday? What version of their father would they grow up knowing? "It wasn't like that," he finally said, his voice rough. "It wasn't some calculated betrayal. Things just evolved." "Evolved," Isabella repeated flatly. "That's an interesting word for theft and murder." "I didn't murder anyone," Marcus snapped, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Then tell me what happened," Isabella challenged. "Tell me the truth, and let me decide." Marcus closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in 2003, in the cramped office space they'd rented in a converted warehouse in Gastown. The smell of burnt coffee and electronics. The whiteboard covered in Nathan's incomprehensible equations. The mounting pressure from investors who wanted results yesterday. The algorithm worked, Marcus began slowly, each word feeling like a stone he was pulling from his chest. Nathan had figured it out. It was brilliant, revolutionary, even. But it needed refinement, testing, capital. We needed investors, and that's where I came in. I set up meetings with venture capital firms, with tech incubators, with anyone who might fund us. He paused, remembering those exhausting months of pitches and rejections. But Nathan was difficult. He didn't trust business people. He thought they'd corrupt his vision, turn it into something commercial and soulless. He wanted to keep control, to develop it slowly, organically. He didn't understand that we were running out of money, that we needed to strike while the technology was hot. So you went behind his back, Isabella said. It wasn't a question. Marcus's jaw tightened. I found investors who were willing to fund us, but they wanted guarantees. They wanted a clear leadership structure. They wanted someone who could make business decisions without getting bogged down in idealistic principles. Nathan was a genius, but he wasn't a businessman. He was your partner, Isabella said coldly. He trusted you. And I was trying to save our company. Marcus shot back, his voice rising before he caught himself, remembering his sleeping daughter. He continued more quietly, Nathan was going to run us into the ground with his stubbornness. I did what I had to do. You stole from him, Isabella stated, pulling out another document, a ledger of some kind, pages and pages of financial transactions. You created shell accounts. You funneled investor money into your personal holdings. You were building your own empire before Thornwell Dynamics even officially existed. Marcus felt his face flush. How had she gotten those records? He'd buried them so deep, had used every legal maneuver to ensure they'd never surface. Nathan found out, Isabella continued relentlessly. My mother said he called her in tears. He discovered what you were doing. He had proof, transaction records, emails, everything. He was going to confront you, and if you didn't make it right, he was going to the authorities. The memory crashed over Marcus like a wave. Yes, Nathan had found out. Marcus could still see the look on his partner's face, betrayal, rage, and something worse, deep, profound disappointment. We fought, Marcus admitted, the words tasting like ash. The worst fight we'd ever had. He called me a thief, a parasite. Said I'd never had an original idea in my life, that I was just a salesman trying to steal a genius's work. He said he was dissolving the partnership, taking the algorithm, and starting over without me. And you couldn't let that happen, Isabella said. Marcus looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not just Nathan's daughter but Nathan himself, the same fierce intelligence, the same unwavering moral clarity that had made his former partner both brilliant and impossible. I didn't kill him, Marcus said again, but even he could hear the weakness in his denial. Isabella stood up, suddenly energized by anger. She walked to the massive windows overlooking the harbor, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. August 14, 2003. Nathan was working late in his home workshop. He'd told my mother he was documenting everything, creating a complete record of your fraud. He was meticulous like that, wanted to have an airtight case before he made any moves. She turned back to face Marcus, and in the fading light, her face was a mask of barely controlled fury. At 11:47 p.m., a fire started in his workshop. The official report said it was electrical, faulty wiring in an old building. But here's what's interesting, Nathan had just had that entire workshop rewired 3 weeks earlier. Professional job, up to code, inspected and certified. Marcus felt ice forming in his veins. He'd forgotten about the rewiring. Or perhaps he'd convinced himself to forget. The fire marshal's report was very thorough, Isabella continued, pacing now like a prosecutor building a case. But there was one investigator who had doubts. Junior guy, fresh out of training. He noted some irregularities. The fire's point of origin didn't match the electrical panel, there were accelerant patterns that seemed inconsistent with an electrical fire. But his supervisor overruled him, closed the case as accidental. She stopped pacing and stared directly at Marcus. That supervisor retired 6 months later with a very generous consulting contract from a shell company. A shell company that, with enough digging, traces back to you. Marcus's hands were shaking now. He'd been so careful, so thorough. But he'd underestimated the determination of a daughter seeking justice for her murdered father. I didn't start that fire, Marcus said, and for the first time, there was genuine desperation in his voice. I swear to you, I didn't. Then who did? Isabella demanded. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Marcus closed his eyes, and the truth he'd been running from for 20 years finally caught up with him. I hired someone, he whispered. The admission was so quiet that Isabella almost didn't hear it. But when the meaning registered, her face went white. "What?" "I didn't want him dead," Marcus said quickly, the words tumbling out now in a desperate rush. "I just wanted the evidence destroyed. I hired a private investigator, a guy who did corporate espionage, industrial theft, that kind of thing. His name was Gerald Vance. I paid him to break into Nathan's workshop and steal his documentation. That's all. Just steal the files." He looked up at Isabella, and she saw genuine anguish in his eyes. But Vance was sloppy, or greedy, or maybe he thought a fire would cover his tracks better. "I don't know. I never asked. Because when I heard about the fire, when I heard Nathan was dead." He swallowed hard. "My first thought wasn't grief. It was relief. The problem was solved. The evidence was gone. Nathan was gone." The confession hung in the air like poison. Isabella stared at him, her chest heaving with emotion. "You hired someone to commit a crime, and when that crime escalated to murder, you were relieved. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying?" "I've lived with it every day for 20 years, Marcus said, and now tears were streaming down his face. "Every success, every achievement, every dollar I've made, it's all been tainted. I see Nathan's face in my dreams. I hear his voice. I've tried to convince myself that I didn't pull the trigger, that I didn't light the match, but I know the truth. I'm responsible for his death." Celeste, still bound and gagged on the floor, was watching this confession unfold with wide, horrified eyes. She'd worked for Marcus Thornwell for 8 months, had respected him as an employer, had felt sympathy for him as a grieving widower. Now she was seeing him for what he really was. Isabella walked slowly back to where Marcus sat with his daughters. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, her whole body rigid with the effort of maintaining control. "What happened to Gerald Vance?" she asked. Marcus's expression turned even darker. "He died 3 years after the fire. Overdose, officially. But I always wondered if someone, maybe the people I bought off, maybe someone else who knew, made sure he'd never talk." "So you've just been living your life," Isabella said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Built your empire on my father's genius and his corpse. Changed your name, created a new identity, married a beautiful woman, had children. Meanwhile, my mother worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. She died without ever seeing justice. I grew up without a father because of your ambition." Marcus looked down at his daughters, one sleeping, one watching him with innocent eyes, and felt the full weight of what he'd done. Not just to Nathan, but to this woman standing before him. To her mother. To an entire family whose lives had been shattered by his choices. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "Prison? My confession? The company? Name it, and it's yours." Isabella laughed, but it was a broken, bitter sound. "You think it's that simple? You think I can just take your money or put you in jail and that will make it right? My father is dead. My mother died heartbroken. No amount of money or punishment can fix that." She sat down heavily on the coffee table, suddenly looking exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind only grief. "I thought I wanted revenge," she said softly. "I thought I wanted to see you destroyed the way you destroyed my family. But being in this house, caring for your daughters, seeing you try to be a good father despite your frequent absences. It's complicated. You're not a monster. You're just a man who made terrible choices and then spent 20 years running from them." She looked at the twins, and her expression softened. "They deserve a father. But they deserve to know who their father really is. Not the carefully constructed image, but the truth, the whole, ugly truth." Marcus felt something shift inside him. For 20 years, he'd been running, hiding, building walls between himself and his past. But maybe the only way forward was through the truth, no matter how much it cost him. "Then let's do it," he said, his voice steady for the first time since this nightmare began. "Let's tell the truth. All of it. But not just to the authorities or the media. To my daughters. When they're old enough to understand, I'll tell them everything. Who their father was, what he did, and how he spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. Isabella stared at him, searching his face for deception. And how exactly do you plan to make it right? The Sentinel algorithm, it's worth approximately $8 billion in current market value, Marcus said. Half of that should have been Nathan's. Which means half should be yours. I'll transfer it. Set up a trust, a foundation in his name. You'll have control over it, decide how it's used. Money can't. I know it can't bring him back, Marcus interrupted. But it can fund scholarships for brilliant kids who can't afford college. It can support research, innovation, all the things Nathan believed in. His legacy doesn't have to be his death. It can be what he created and what that creation makes possible. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing this offer. It was more than she'd expected, but also somehow not enough. Nothing could be enough. And you, she asked. What happens to you? I'll make a public statement, Marcus said. Not the full truth, I have daughters to protect, employees who depend on me. But I'll acknowledge Nathan as the true creator of the Sentinel algorithm. I'll make his name as famous as mine should have been. And I'll live the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the second chance I don't deserve. He looked directly into her eyes, his own red-rimmed and exhausted. I can't undo what I did. But I can stop running from it. And maybe, someday, when my daughters ask me about the man their company is named after, I can tell them about Nathan Hartley, and tell them the truth about their father's greatest failure in his life's work of redemption. Isabella felt tears streaming down her own face now. This wasn't the clean revenge she'd imagined. There was no satisfying moment of watching him destroy himself, no triumphant justice. Just a broken man offering inadequate restitution for an irredeemable crime, and a woman who had to decide if that was enough. She looked at Celeste, still bound on the floor, who nodded slightly, a signal that she understood, that she would stand by whatever Isabella decided. Untie her, Isabella said quietly. And then we're going to spend the rest of the night going through every document, every piece of evidence, every detail. We're going to create a complete record of what happened to Nathan Hartley. And you're going to sign a confession, witnessed and notarized, admitting your role in his death. Marcus nodded. Whatever you need. And one more thing, Isabella added, her voice hardening again. I want Gerald Vance investigated. If someone silenced him, if there are other people involved in covering this up, I want them exposed. All of them. Agreed, Marcus said. As Marcus gently laid his sleeping daughter in her crib and carried the other to join her sister, Isabella began untying Celeste. The older woman pulled the tape from her mouth with a gasp, then immediately embraced her niece. Are you okay, Mija? Celeste whispered in rapid French. I don't know, Isabella answered honestly. But it's done. It's finally done. The night ahead would be long and difficult. There would be lawyers, notaries, documents to sign, and truths to be recorded. The foundation of Marcus Thornwell's empire would be fundamentally shaken, and the world would learn that their visionary CEO had built his success on another man's genius. But as the first light of dawn began to break over Vancouver's harbor, something else was also beginning, not redemption, perhaps, because some sins are too great for that, but a form of justice that acknowledged the complexity of human failure and the long, difficult work of making amends. The ghost of Nathan Hartley would never rest easy. But perhaps, finally, his daughter could.